Hello and welcome to the World War Lab channel. Today, we're diving into a moment when science, courage, and desperation collided in the frozen forests of Europe, changing the course of warfare forever. December 16, 1944. Early morning in the area of Monschau, Germany. The frozen ground shook as another salvo of American artillery screamed through the sky. But something was different this time. Terrifyingly and incomprehensibly different. The shells were not crashing into the earth or exploding among the trees. Instead, they were detonating in midair, precisely above the advancing German positions. From those explosions fell a deadly rain of steel fragments, a storm of shrapnel so perfectly calculated that no foxhole, no ditch, no natural cover could offer protection. Among the soldiers of the 326th Volksgrenadier Division, who were attacking positions of the 38th Cavalry Squadron. Even veterans hardened by years of brutal combat on the Eastern Front encountered something that shattered their understanding of how artillery worked. This was not the familiar pattern of impacts and predictable danger zones. There were no safe spaces, no protective value in digging deeper. This was death descending from the sky with cold, mathematical precision. At that exact moment, Colonel Oscar Alfred Axelson of the 406th Artillery Group had just made one of the most consequential unauthorized decisions of the entire Battle of the Bulge. Acting against standing orders and without approval from higher command, he ordered his gunners to load shells equipped with one of the most closely guarded secrets in the Allied arsenal: proximity fuses. These devices contain miniature radar systems capable of detecting their distance from the ground or from human targets and detonating at the optimal height. Their use would increase artillery lethality by as much as 50 times. In the frozen forests of the Ardennes, the very mathematics of death were about to be rewritten. The German soldiers advancing that morning had no way of knowing that they were encountering a weapon so revolutionary that it would not only reshape this battle, but permanently alter the nature of warfare itself. The storm had been unleashed. Operation Watch on the Rhine had begun with enormous confidence for the Wehrmacht. Hitler's final gamble involved more than 200,000 German soldiers, around 1,000 tanks, and nearly 2,000 artillery pieces, all concealed in secrecy by the dense fog and forests of the Ardennes. The Führer had promised his generals that this massive offensive would split the Allied armies in two and allow the recapture of Antwerp, turning the tide of a war that was slipping inexorably toward defeat. The initial bombardment at 5:30 a.m. on December 16th had achieved complete tactical surprise. German artillery fired at an astonishing rate of 1,600 rounds per minute along an 85-mile front. American intelligence had failed catastrophically. They had not detected the massive buildup of enemy forces, and many frontline units were either inexperienced replacements or exhausted veterans sent to what was believed to be a quiet sector for rest. But near Monschau, Colonel Axelson faced an impossible tactical situation. The 38th Cavalry Squadron, a lightly armed reconnaissance unit, was being crushed by far superior German forces. Conventional artillery methods were not enough to halt the assault. In desperation, Axelson made his historic decision: deploy the secret proximity fuse shells without authorization. He knew this choice could lead to a court-martial, but in that moment he also understood that obedience meant certain defeat. The effect was immediate and catastrophic for the attackers. German soldiers advancing in traditional assault formations suddenly found themselves under a form of fire they had never experienced before. The shells exploded 30 to 50 feet above their heads. Each airburst created a massive cone of high-velocity fragments that covered an area far larger than any ground impact shell could. Men who knew exactly how to survive normal artillery bombardments were cut down in their foxholes, behind trees, in ditches, and in every place they sought refuge. This was the secret science of death. The proximity fuse represented the absolute peak of American scientific innovation, combined with industrial power. Unlike conventional shells that relied on direct impact or time fuses that often detonated at incorrect heights, the proximity fuse contained a fully self-contained radar system no larger than a coffee can. Inside each fuse, Engineers had packed approximately 130 electronic components, including 4 or 5 miniature vacuum tubes, depending on the model. These components had to survive the unimaginable force of being fired from an artillery piece, enduring acceleration forces of up to 20,000 times the force of gravity. The physics behind the system were staggering. At the instant of firing, the violent acceleration crushed a small glass ampoule filled with electrolyte, instantly creating a battery that powered the tiny radar for the duration of the shell's flight. The radar emitted signals that reflected off the ground or nearby objects, and when the reflection reached a certain threshold, the fuse triggered detonation at exactly the most lethal height. Dr. Merle Tuve at the Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Laboratory drove this development with an intensity comparable to the Manhattan Project. The laboratory itself was disguised as an abandoned used car dealership in Silver Spring, Maryland. At its peak, it employed roughly 3% of all American physicists. Security protocols matched those of the atomic bomb program. Workers were forbidden from discussing their work, even with family members, and each proximity fuse carried a unique serial number, so it could be tracked throughout production and deployment. The technical challenge had once seemed nearly impossible. Vacuum tubes originally designed for living room radios had to be completely reinvented. They needed to survive the brutal shock of firing, function while spinning at extreme rotational speeds, operate in every weather condition, and remain sensitive enough to detect targets without triggering prematurely. The crucial breakthrough came through miniaturization techniques that would later transform the entire electronics industry. Dr. James Van Allen developed vacuum tubes no larger than pencil erasers, yet containing all the essential elements of conventional radio tubes. By December 1944, American factories were producing approximately 40,000 proximity fuses every single day. More than 100 companies participated in the program, including giants such as RCA and General Electric, as well as Sylvania and the Crosley Corporation. The total cost of the program reached $1 billion in 1940s currency, making it second only to the Manhattan Project in wartime spending. Axelson's unauthorized use of the fuses on December 16th triggered an immediate crisis within the chain of command. He had violated direct orders that restricted proximity fuses exclusively to anti-aircraft defense. The fear was that if a fuse were captured intact, German engineers might reverse engineer the technology. But the results at Monshaw were impossible to ignore. The German attack had been stopped cold, and the casualties inflicted were shocking to both sides. Reports of the weapon's effectiveness reached Supreme Headquarters with incredible speed. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, fully aware of how desperate the situation across the Ardennes had become, formally requested authorization to expand their use on December 19th. Just 2 days later, on December 21st, all remaining restrictions were lifted. Proximity fuses were released for general ground combat use across the entire Battle of the Bulge battlefield. What followed was a powerful demonstration of American logistical superiority. The rapid distribution of these revolutionary fuses to frontline artillery units ensured that the terrifying rain of steel unleashed above Monshaw would soon reshape combat all across the frozen forests of the Ardennes. Within days, proximity fuse shells were reaching artillery units all across the Ardennes. The 463rd Parachute Field Artillery Battalion at Bastogne received its first allocation just as the German ring tightened around the town. The 420th Armored Field Artillery Battalion, operating their M7 pre-self-propelled howitzers, began firing them to defend the northwestern approaches. The 969th Artillery Battalion, an African-American unit commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Hubert D. Barnes, employed them with devastating effects southwest of Bastogne. Every unit that used them reached the same conclusion. Proximity fuses transform artillery from a supporting arm into a decisive battlefield weapon. Forward observers no longer needed to painstakingly adjust fire. The fuse itself determined the optimal detonation point. Accuracy requirements dropped dramatically while lethality increased at an exponential rate. Bastogne stood as the ultimate proof. Surrounded, outnumbered, yet tactically superior, The siege of Bastogne became the perfect demonstration of how proximity fuses reshaped defensive warfare. The 101st Airborne Division, completely encircled by German forces, held the critical crossroads against repeated and determined assaults. Their artillery support included the 463rd Parachute Field Artillery Battalion, equipped with 75mm pack howitzers capable of firing proximity-fused shells. Between December 19th and December 31st, official unit records show that the 463rd fired exactly 7,676 rounds. Not all of them were proximity-fused due to limited supply, but those that had an overwhelming physical and psychological impact. German assault formations simply dissolved under the air bursts. Entire platoons were wiped out in seconds as steel fragments rained down from above. The attack of December 22nd, following General McCullough's famous Nuts reply to the German surrender demand, became one of the clearest examples of the weapon's effectiveness. German infantry advanced across snow-covered fields in traditional formations, believing discipline and momentum would carry them forward. Instead, proximity-fused shells detonated overhead with perfect timing. Overlapping airbursts created patterns of destruction that left no safe zones, no cover, and no escape. The all-African-American 969th Artillery Battalion played an equally crucial role in the defense. Their 155mm howitzers created a ring of death around Bastogne's perimeter that German forces could not penetrate. The larger shells, detonating at heights of around 50 feet, covered even wider areas with lethal fragments. German prisoners later reported that attacking units often lost cohesion before they even reached American lines. Soldiers broke and fled from the incomprehensible explosions in the air, unable to understand or counter what was happening to them. The Our River slaughter became perhaps the most thoroughly documented example of proximity-fused lethality. It occurred near the Our River close to Echternach on December 25th and 26th. General George S. Patton, whose Third Army was pushing north to relieve Bastogne, personally witnessed this engagement and later described it in his memoir, War as I Knew It. A German battalion attempted to cross the partially frozen river, believing darkness and fog concealed them from American observation. Under normal circumstances, traditional artillery would have required careful adjustment, giving the Germans time either to complete the crossing or to find cover. Proximity-fused shells required no such correction. Patton wrote, "We caught a German battalion crossing the Our. The new proximity ammunition was devastating. The shells burst in the air above them. They had nowhere to run. The river behind them, our fire in front and above. When the firing stopped, we counted 702 bodies. That number, 702 killed by actual count, stands as one of the few precisely documented casualty figures resulting from proximity-fused use. The mathematical efficiency was chilling. A single battalion effectively ceased to exist within minutes, with no possibility of defense or escape. The psychological shockwave spread rapidly through German units in the sector. Soldiers began refusing orders to attempt river crossings under similar conditions. Forest warfare itself was transformed. The dense forests of the Ardennes, which German forces had relied on for concealment and protection, became death traps once proximity fuses entered the equation. In open terrain, a shell detonating at 30 to 50 feet was already devastating. In forest, the effect multiplied many times over. The airburst shattered branches and trunks, creating thousands of additional wooden projectiles. Splinters, some as long as a man's arm, flew at hundreds of feet per second with lethal force. Traditional defensive methods became useless. Taking cover behind large trees or digging foxholes beneath root systems no longer offered protection. Death came from above, and it came in every direction. Centuries of tactical wisdom about fighting in forests were rendered obsolete. American artillery units quickly recognized this multiplier effect. A single proximity-fused 155mm shell detonating above the canopy could clear an area the size of a tennis court of all living things. The combination of steel fragments and wooden splinters created a complete 360-degree kill zone that no amount of training or experience could overcome. German units trained extensively in forest warfare found their expertise meaningless. Spreading out to avoid concentrated casualties only exposed soldiers to the wide area effects of the air bursts. Clustering together for mutual support meant entire squads could be annihilated by a single shell. There was no correct tactical response. Every choice led to destruction. This was technical supremacy in action. The proximity fuse operated on principles that sounded like science fiction to soldiers of the 1940s. Each fuse contained a miniature radio transmitter operating in the 180 to 220 megahertz range. It continuously emitted radio waves that reflected off everything around it: the ground, trees, vehicles, and human bodies. As the shell descended, the strength of the reflected signal increased. When it reached a predetermined level corresponding to the optimal burst height, an electronic switch triggered the explosion. The entire system had to function perfectly under conditions that bordered on the impossible, conditions that would have destroyed any normal electronic equipment. During firing, the acceleration reached nearly 20,000 times the force of Earth's gravity, enough to crush a human body into microscopic thickness. The shells also spun at extreme speeds, creating massive centrifugal forces inside the fuse. Temperatures shifted violently, from the searing heat of the gun barrel, which could exceed 3,000 degrees Fahrenheit, to the sub-zero cold encountered at the peak of the shell's trajectory. And yet, the delicate vacuum tubes, protected by innovative cushioning and shock absorption systems, survive and function with reliability rates exceeding 80%. The optimal burst heights have been determined through exhaustive testing at the Ardennes Proving Ground. For the standard 105mm divisional howitzers, 30 feet proved to be ideal. The heavier 155mm guns achieved maximum lethality at around 50 feet. The rare and massive 240mm shells produced devastating effects at heights of 70 feet or more, capable of clearing entire grid squares of enemy forces. This overwhelming technological superiority translated directly into dominance on the battlefield. Studies showed that proximity fuses increase lethality by 5 to 10 times compared to conventional shells, while the effective lethal fragment area expanded by a factor of 50. In anti-aircraft roles, the improvement was even more dramatic. The success rate of shooting down V-1 flying bombs jumped from just 17% to an astonishing 79% within weeks of proximity fuse deployment. The German intelligence failure regarding proximity fuses proved disastrous. In December 1944, Wehrmacht forces overran an American ammunition depot and captured roughly 20,000 proximity fuse shells. This should have been an intelligence goldmine that triggered immediate countermeasure development. Instead, German technical specialists examined the captured fuses and declared them impossible. The very presence of vacuum tubes inside an artillery shell contradicted everything German engineers believed about electronics and ballistics. They concluded that the Americans must be using some form of magnetic detection, or that the visible components were decoys hiding the real mechanism. This failure was rooted partly in institutional blindness. Before the war, Germany had actually led in proximity fuse development. Rheinmetall Borsig and AEG Berlin had produced working prototypes as early as 1940. But Hitler's order canceling all weapons projects that required more than 6 months to reach production had terminated the program. German engineers simply could not accept that the Americans had solved problems they themselves had abandoned. The irony deepened when German technical capabilities were examined more closely. Their own electrostatic proximity fuses, which relied on changes in electrical capacitance rather than radar, showed 95% reliability in testing. Had development continued, Germany might have fielded operational proximity fuses as early as 1941. Hermann Göring would later admit during interrogation that German proximity fuses were only 3 or 4 months from production when the war ended. Christmas brought no peace. December 25th, 1944 delivered what became known as the Christmas catastrophe. German units attempting to use the holiday for resupply and reorganization discovered that proximity fuses recognized no ceasefires. Field kitchens, supply convoys, and assembly areas were suddenly subjected to devastating bombardments that required no forward observers. The 420th Armored Field Artillery Battalion alone fired more than 1,000 rounds on Christmas Day, most of them proximity fused. Their M7 pre-self-propelled howitzers delivered rapid and accurate fire that caught German formations completely unprepared. The ability to fire effectively without visual observation, in darkness and in terrible weather, transformed artillery from a primarily daytime weapon into a continuous 24-hour threat. The psychological impact was immense. German soldiers had learned that poor weather offered safety, since Allied aircraft could not fly and observers could not direct artillery fire. Proximity fuses destroyed that sanctuary. Death could arrive at any moment, in any weather, without warning beyond the brief, haunting whistle of incoming shells. Malmedy and Skorzny's elite forces soon learned this lesson. On December 21st, SS Colonel Otto Skorzny's elite commandos attempted to capture Malmedy. These were not ordinary soldiers. They were specially selected troops who had rescued Mussolini, nearly captured Tito, and infiltrated American lines wearing U.S. uniforms. They represented the very best Germany could deploy. They were met with devastating proximity-fused artillery fire that turned their American disguises from a tactical advantage into death shrouds. The shells burst overhead with uncanny precision, as if they could sense the impostors beneath them. Although exact casualty figures remain disputed, the attack collapsed catastrophically. Losses were so severe that they effectively ended Skorzny's offensive operations. The psychological breakdown among these elite SS troops was particularly significant. Indoctrinated with beliefs in German superiority and trained to the highest standards, they found themselves utterly helpless against American technology. Some survivors reportedly charged directly toward American lines, preferring a quick death to continued bombardment. It was a complete collapse of discipline among Hitler's most fanatical and elite formations. Behind all of this stood an industrial achievement as remarkable as any of the war. By December 1944, more than 100 American companies had converted to proximity fuse production. The Crosley Corporation abandoned refrigerator manufacturing to assemble fuses. Emerson Radio retooled from home electronics to weapons production. Sylvania, RCA, and General Electric dedicated entire facilities to the program. Quality control standards exceeded anything previously attempted in mass production. Each of the approximately 130 individual components inside every fuse was tested separately. Every solder joint was inspected under magnification. Random samples were actually fired from artillery pieces to ensure they could survive combat conditions. The rejection rate was merciless. Any component that showed the slightest deviation from specifications was discarded. The workforce, made up predominantly of women, maintained this incredible precision while working 12-hour shifts, 6 days a week. They had no idea what they were building because of strict security compartmentalization. They only knew it was vital to the war effort. By December 1944, production had reached such levels that they were manufacturing one proximity fuse every 2 seconds around the clock. The reduction in cost was just as astonishing as a technical achievement. In 1942, each proximity fuse cost about $732, more than the average worker earned in an entire year. By December 1944, mass production and industrial refinement had driven that cost down to just $18 per unit while maintaining strict quality standards. This efficiency made it possible to manufacture roughly 22 million proximity fuses during the war, with about 200,000 of them deployed during the Battle of the Bulge alone. Patton understood the value of proximity fuses better than perhaps any other commander. His Third Army, driving relentlessly to relieve Bastogne, used them as a breakthrough weapon rather than merely a defensive tool. His artillery commander, Brigadier General Edward Williams, developed entirely new tactics built around proximity fuse employment. Williams pioneered time-on-target concentrations using proximity fuse shells, coordinating multiple battalions so that their rounds would arrive simultaneously over the target. When dozens of shells detonated at the optimal height at the same instant, the effect was apocalyptic. German soldiers came to call it the bell toll of death. In the single week between December 22nd and December 29th, Patton's Third Army fired approximately 50,000 proximity fuse shells. The impact was decisive in breaking German resistance and opening the corridor to Bastogne. Patton himself later wrote, "The funny fuse won the battle of the Bulge for us." Elsenborn Ridge provided another stark demonstration of proximity fuses at their maximum effectiveness. Here, the 2nd and 99th Infantry Divisions held critical terrain against the 6th SS Panzer Army, including the elite 1st SS Panzer Division, Leibstandard Adolf Hitler. Over 3 days, from December 17th to December 19th, American artillery fired about 160,000 rounds, with roughly 40,000 of them being proximity fused. Those 25% of shells were responsible for an estimated 60% of the more than 5,000 German casualties. The mathematics were impossible to ignore. Proximity fuses multiplied American firepower by roughly a factor of 4. German attacks launched repeatedly up the steep, forested slopes met solid walls of steel, exploding in midair. Entire companies vanished in seconds. Bodies piled so densely that subsequent assault waves were forced to climb over their own dead. After 3 days of such losses, the attack stopped. The elite of the Waffen-SS had been broken not by manpower alone, but by American technology. Operation Bodenplatte brought the next dramatic proof. On January 1st, 1945, the Luftwaffe launched a massive surprise attack against Allied airfields. Nearly 900 German fighters struck, catching many Allied aircraft on the ground and achieving momentary tactical success. But as the German pilots returned, they flew into walls of proximity-fused anti-aircraft fire. Of the 277 German aircraft lost that day, 172 were destroyed by anti-aircraft guns, most of them using proximity fuses. The kill rate shocked both sides. German pilots, trained to evade predictive flak patterns, found shells detonating precisely where they would cause maximum damage. The Luftwaffe, already crippled, never recovered from these losses. By early January 1945, maintaining secrecy was no longer possible. Too many shells had been fired. Too many soldiers had seen their effects firsthand. On January 6th, the War Department authorized limited disclosure. The New York Times reported the existence of a new type of artillery shell that dramatically multiplied the effectiveness of American guns, without revealing the underlying technology. German intelligence finally grasped the significance of the weapon, but far too late. A January 10th report from Foreign Armies West stated, "The Americans possess a radio-controlled artillery fuse that detonates shells at optimal height for anti-personnel effect. This weapon has caused severe casualties among our forces in the Ardennes. No effective countermeasures exist." Post-war assessments confirmed the decisive strategic impact. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt stated, "The proximity fuse was decisive. Our attacks broke down not because of American courage, though they fought well, but because of artillery that seemed to have eyes." General Otto von Manschenfeld, commander of the 5th Panzer Army, testified, "The American artillery was the terror of our soldiers, especially the new shells that exploded in the air. They caused panic even among veteran troops." The statistics told the same story. Roughly 200,000 proximity fuse shells were fired during the campaign, accounting for an estimated 15,000 to 20,000 German casualties, as much as 20% of total German losses in the Ardennes. The weapon achieved 5 to 10 times the effectiveness of conventional ammunition, while eliminating the need for forward observation in poor weather and darkness. Yet behind every statistic lay human tragedy. German soldiers, many of them teenagers conscripted in the final desperate months of the war, died in ways that traditional warfare had never envisioned. They were hunted by weapons that seemed almost intelligent, able to find them wherever they hid. American production workers paid their own hidden price. Factory accidents were suppressed for security reasons. Workers at Crosley Emerson Radio and other plants suffered breakdowns from exhaustion and stress. They built weapons of unprecedented lethality without knowing what they were making, carrying that burden in enforced silence. The moral calculation of war was never simple. The Battle of the Bulge cost nearly 19,000 American lives. Without proximity fuses, how many more would have died? How much longer would the war have continued? How many more victims of the Holocaust would have perished while the fighting dragged on? Every day the war was shortened, potentially saved thousands in concentration camps awaiting liberation. The technological legacy of the proximity fuse program extended far beyond the battlefield. The miniaturized vacuum tubes developed for fuses became foundational to post-war electronics. The quality control systems designed for fuse production set new industrial standards. The organizational methods used to coordinate hundreds of suppliers helped pioneer modern supply chain management. Dr. James Van Allen applied the expertise he had gained in miniaturization to satellite instrumentation, later leading to his discovery of Earth's radiation belts. The radar principles developed for proximity fuse evolved directly into modern radar systems. The idea that a weapon could sense its environment and make its own decision became the foundation for guided missiles and, eventually, for all smart weapons. Every precision-guided munition used today can trace its lineage back to the proximity fuse. It was the first weapon that could detect its surroundings and choose the exact moment to detonate. The revolution that began in the Ardennes continues on modern battlefields, where smart weapons now dominate warfare. Final reckoning. The Battle of the Bulge ended on January 25, 1945, with German forces in full retreat. Hitler's last great offensive had cost Germany approximately 100,000 casualties and achieved nothing of strategic value. American losses totaled about 75,000, including nearly 19,000 killed. The proximity fuse had proven itself not merely as another weapon, but as a war-winning technology. General Eisenhower later stated that if the Germans had possessed proximity fuses, the D-Day landings might have been made exceedingly difficult, perhaps even impossible. That assessment alone underscored their true strategic importance. They were not just an improvement to artillery. They were a revolutionary breakthrough that fundamentally changed the mathematics of warfare. German soldiers who faced proximity fuse artillery experienced something entirely unprecedented. Death delivered by shells that seemed intelligent, that could find them wherever they hid, that transformed the very air above them into a killing zone. Their experience marked a moment when warfare fully entered the technological age. From Colonel Axelson's unauthorized first use on December 16, 1944, to the systematic deployment of more than 200,000 shells across the Ardennes, proximity fuses proved that scientific innovation could provide decisive military advantage. The convergence of American industrial capacity, scientific brilliance, and tactical adaptation produced a weapon that helped determine the outcome of the war. The story of the proximity fuse is ultimately a story of transformation, technological, tactical, and human. It demonstrated that an industrial democracy could produce weapons of devastating effectiveness, that innovation could overcome numerical disadvantage, and that the side with superior science would likely prevail. These lessons shaped not only the remainder of World War II, but the entire structure of warfare that followed. In the frozen forests of the Ardennes, the age of technological warfare truly arrived. The mathematics of death were rewritten by tiny radar sets hidden inside artillery shells, forever changing how humans wage war. The German soldiers who died beneath proximity-fused airbursts were not only casualties of a single battle, but victims of a revolution in military affairs that continues to shape our world today.